at ACU been drawing on your work and recent research to underpin ACU's work in equity and to progress the work in this area to widen our participation. However, I would like to go back and start at the beginning. So you often start with the importance of the autobiography of the question. Can you talk a little bit about this and about your own autobiography of the question?
Thank you, Nicola. And before I do that, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be with you and colleagues at ACU and to celebrate your commitment and our mutual commitment to building equitable higher education. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the beautiful Awabakal land and to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present, and future. And it's a real honor to be speaking from this land and to understand how much there is to continuously learn about equity in higher education from the traditional custodians of the land. So can I have my first slide, please? Or change the slide, I should say, to slide 2. Thank you. So coming to this wonderful idea of the autobiography of the question. So everything that we do is autobiographical. Necessarily, we bring our histories, our perspectives, our experiences, our values, our assumptions to our work, and we're always socially located. So, we can't remove ourselves just because we want to from the complex power relations in which we're embedded. And so we can't set ourselves apart from that. So we actually do need some tools to help us recognize that social situatedness in those power dynamics and in those histories of inequality, and to exercise reflexivity, as Mary spoke about so powerfully just now. So that is, we need the tools of praxis. That is to engage in ongoing processes of critical reflection or reflexivity, to shape action and to bring action back in a cyclical process to critical reflection. This is what I call praxis. It's a very big field, and there are a lot of eminent scholars and theorists attached to this notion. But basically, this is what I mean when I talk about praxis, this dialogical cyclical process. So in my own journey of developing praxis-based approaches, I just want to acknowledge Jane Miller, because I was tutored by Jane many, many years ago in the mid-1990s. She was one of my master's tutors. And she presented this idea of the autobiography of the question. And it obviously just really sparked my imagination. And it's something that I've used and crafted into a pedagogical tool. But this idea was really, she used to help practitioners find their way into often really esoteric and elitist academic fields. And we know what that feels like when we're trying to read social theory, and to make connection with research and theory, but at the same time to strongly bring in their own voices, knowledges, and experiences and insights. So Jane points out, and this is, I think, a really important point, that we're all theorists. So we make sense of the world through our interpretations and the life experiences that bring meaning to our work and practice. That's even if we think that we're being objective or value-free. We always do. And we do things in a particular way because we have a theory about that way of doing things, even when this is not made explicit or we don't think that we have a theory about it. So that's, I think, really important. So I offer this idea of the autobiography of the question as a tool of praxis, a way of sense-making of ourselves in relation to the questions that we ask about equity. And those questions are really important. They're not neutral. They shape the way we think and imagine what equity is. So when we're thinking about equity, we are necessarily, even if it's not made explicit, troubling the complex histories of inequality that have profoundly shaped who is seen as having the right to higher education and on what terms. So equity should always raise questions, I think, about the assumptions made about the purpose of higher education. Sometimes we don't even stop to think about, okay, why are we widening participation? What are we engaged in when we're doing this work? and what are the different and contested values at play that create, in Foucauldian terms, this idea of regimes of truth, the way we imagine what it is we're engaged in, that becomes so powerful in our thinking. And this enables a reflexive approach to the idea that higher education, the dominant kind of idea that it's mainly about economic imperatives, and helps us to interrogate assumptions framed by the dominance of human capital theories. And we can do that through the lens of social justice questioning. So much of my research has shown that students are motivated to engage in higher education because they do want, a meaningful career, but also they have a commitment to make a difference to others in their communities. And that really is a motivating factor. So my own autobiography of the question draws from my personal experiences of accessing higher education at a very vulnerable time in my life. I left school early. I had been forced to move to another country. I had a period of homelessness, and I had a very traumatic experience. And I just discovered access to higher education in the UK. And I would go as far as saying higher education was life-saving for me and my children. And, I discovered sociology on the Access course. And, it was just so amazing because I found a language to make sense of my experiences, but also the experiences of my peers in their struggles to access and participate in higher education. And through this, I became a passionate advocate, practitioner, and researcher around equity in higher education. But I also increasingly, as I moved through these different stages of what became a career, I never set out to have a career, but I became really frustrated that the incredibly rich and powerful insights of critical theory and methodology were so often absent from the development of equity policy and practice. But I also became frustrated that the powerful insights of students themselves and staff from historically marginalized communities was also largely silenced. So this profound absence of the tools and insights and wisdom that could enable transformative frameworks for equity, I came to understand as feeding the rather derogatory and harmful discourses of deficit, what I call deficit imaginaries. And this produces flawed questions, I think, that distorts the project of building equity and helps sustain and reproduce inequalities in and through higher education. So through these encountering of the field as a practitioner, as a researcher, as a student, I became really influenced by the notion of praxis and started to develop a praxis-based framework that would allow the collective interrogation of taken for granted values, assumptions, and perspectives that are so embedded in institutionalized histories of exclusion, and to generate new forms of research-informed practice and practice-informed research. So could I have the next slide, please? So on this slide, I'm just giving you a sneak peek. This is not actually live yet, of an open access site that offers a whole range of resources, some of those creative resources that try to get to the heart of the experiences of inequality that people bring with them to higher education. And so eventually you'll be able to find that on www.equityhe.com, but I'll let everyone know when that site becomes live. It's just a way of sharing some of these ideas and hopefully people having access to those. So just saying a little bit more about praxis-based approaches, they help to enable the disruption of deficit imaginaries that are so deeply problematic because they locate the problem of equity. So the way that we frame the questions we ask tends to focus our attention on the supposed deficiencies of the individual seen as disadvantaged and through particular categorizations. And I've argued in my work that such deficit imaginaries lean heavily into problematic and decontextualized, and I would even go so far as saying dehumanizing forms of student support based on remediation, rather than to tackle the complex dynamics of power and knowledge in the formation of studenthood, the recognition of personhood, the recognition of capability that is so central to a sense of belonging in higher education, and for which teaching plays a major role, but is often kind of not in the key focus. So it's through praxis-oriented approaches that we can grapple with these complexities and start to move away from the deficit imaginaries that are so deeply embedded in the ways in which we have constructed equity in higher education, and move more towards a transformative social justice praxis for equity.
Thank you, Penny. You mentioned in there, those notions of social justice are obviously central, and that you came to education and you're realising that higher education, as you put it, should be a vehicle of social justice. Can you tell us a bit more about why you think this is needed and why it's important?
Well, I think that the way we think about equity is very bland. So we tend to think of it as getting numbers of students from different categories into higher education and through higher education in relation to a particular kind of construction of success. And we don't really think about the power of higher education. It's a powerful social institution. It's a powerful space of knowledge production, including knowledge about what equity is and what equity means, and that's how policy and practice is developed with powerful effects. And most often, underrepresented groups and communities are excluded from processes of producing knowledge, even when their lives and their educational access is so deeply affected by the knowledge being produced, including, for example, the social policy categorizations that are imposed on excluded groups and communities associated with equity policy and practice. So all of this has an effect on their lives, identities, experiences, and the dominant methods of measurement, this kind of focus on measurement all the time, I would argue go nowhere close to ethical representation of underrepresented groups and building deeper understanding of this project that we're engaged in.
Sorry, Penny, to interrupt, but that's a really interesting point. Can you just say a bit more about that, the measurement and
Yeah, I will. I'm going to say a little bit more as I go through, because, it's a really limiting way that we think about how we can know about equity and, who is the subject or even the object of that knowledge. So, my argument is that rather than those forms of methods, or including those, maybe including some of those, we need around that to think about the methodologies, because those methods of measurement, again, they're situated within particular epistemological assumptions about what knowledge is and how it's produced, but it's and also how meaning is interpreted and who has the privilege of interpreting that meaning. But it's hidden. So we just go straight into the method. We go straight into measurement rather than thinking about these broader methodologies that are being put to work and the ethics around those. And, the way that we need to think about this in terms of the politics of knowing, who gets to know, who gets to claim a position as knower, and the politics of knowledge, who gets to participate in producing knowledge and having that knowledge legitimized. So, these are really, really important questions. And I'm not saying we don't need evidence and data to understand unequal patterns of participation. So it's not that those methods are not important, but it's that we need much more thinking about the methodological frameworks and ethical frameworks that frame how we approach these questions. So, I think that what we need to do is really broaden the scope to think about research-informed and theoretically rich approaches to developing equity policy and practice that is explicitly underpinned by social justice theories and principles and framed by a deep commitment to ethics. I don't mean just like getting ethical approval. I mean, that's obviously very, very important, helps us get into a process of thinking about what we're doing, but really think about the ethics of representation, for example. So higher education equity might become then a site of participatory praxis in which we develop rich understanding in collaboration with those most affected by equity policy and practice. So this enables those in relatively powerful positions in universities. Those, for example, we may not feel powerful, but when we have the power to make a judgment of somebody else, or when we have the power to assess somebody else's work, that's a form of power, and we need to engage in critical reflexivity about our practice in relation to those wider institutional frameworks that, obviously limit as well what can we do as a collective to make a difference. So higher education is a site of immense resources and opportunities. So, how might we reframe our equity practices as a form of redistribution? How might we take those rich resources available within universities, both material and intellectual, to our local and wider communities who've historically been excluded from having access to those resources? So rather than taking a remedial approach, such as the idea of going out and raising aspirations, this idea that we need to raise the aspirations, how might we instead focus on building meaningful relationships with our local communities and build a sense of trust, in the context of generations and histories of gross injustices that people have experienced in relation to the formation of knowledge. So how can we build trust and a sense of belonging through those processes? And also, how can we think about this in relation to questions of recognition? So recognition of knowledge, recognition of personhood, and think about that in terms of the assumptions that continue to play out about who has the right to higher education. That these are underpinned by value judgments that we share, and often we don't have the opportunity to interrogate within our communities of practice about notions of talent, notions of potential, notions of capability. So this means we must interrogate how the values we share within the discipline or professional context we take for granted, we're immersed in, and it's a wonderful space of collective identity and sharing, and that's all very important. But sometimes through that sharing, we miss the assumptions we bring in terms of the values we bring into that. So, how is potential and capability judged within those contexts? And who is recognized as having capability and potential? And how do we make those assessments? And are those kind of embedded in particular value judgments? And how are these exclusive? So that, and just paying attention to, for example, the different constructions that have been created through social policy. So, for example, the construction of LSES students. So the histories around inequalities of economic maldistribution and social class are implicated in those constructions. But through the discursive iteration of LSES students, the person associated with that iteration is subjected to a homogeneous construction, which is then also connected to social histories of stigmatization and deficit. So, without paying attention to the iterations of these categorizations that we take for granted, we do harm without meaning to, perhaps. And, I consider this a form of misrecognition with powerful effects on the recognition of capability and belonging. So I just want to say a little bit more in response to this question, which is about deficit imaginaries. And I wonder if you could just go to the next slide, please. So deficit refers to the framing of equity as a problem that requires the kind of treatment. There seems like there's a kind of diagnosis of a problem that requires treatment of the perceived deficiencies of individuals from disadvantaged categorizations. So equity strategies are then targeted towards remedial interventions that seek to either raise aspirations or assist students to assimilate into the dominant culture of the university. And so this deficit framing tends to ignore the kinds of social inequalities and conditions I've just been referring to. And so this means that deficit, this idea of deficit imaginaries, deficit is built into the foundations of equity agendas. So it's not so much that we need to be more mindful. We do need to be more mindful of the language we use, but that's not enough. It's about really having understanding, deep understanding of how those foundations have worked and are being reproduced in our assumptions about deficit. And so deficit imaginaries locates equity as largely outside the university. Either that, so it's like located in those communities that are associated with those categorizations as somehow being deficient, or at the peripheries of the university with responsibility for equity being held by a particular person or unit being tasked with the role of equity in some way. Or indeed in the embodiment of equity itself, those who are marked out as equity students, and we often talk about equity students through their association with those social policy categorizations. And this makes meaning of who they are, what their needs are seen to be, and what value they do or do not hold for the university. So in this way, higher education is seen as a neutral space where people who are marginalized are then included in the dominant framework or way of being. And I would argue that this version of inclusion is a form of misrecognition or status subordination, and unwittingly feeds into sustaining inequalities despite efforts to build equity. So a more compelling question for inclusion might be, how might we transform our practices, our systems, our structures, and think about so for example, if we take curriculum, a deep approach to transforming the curriculum in ways that includes the knowledges, histories, and perspectives of those communities that have been marginalized from parity of participation. And so this has to include attention to redistribution of opportunities and resources, recognition of the experiences, cultures, and identities of those communities who have been misrecognized through deficit imaginaries, and also representation of those otherwise excluded from shaping the project of transforming higher education to become more inclusive. So in these ways, we might then think about higher education as a social institution that can be mobilized as a vehicle for social justice.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And in your book, Penny, in your book, The Right to Higher Education, you do actually interrogate who is seen as having the right to higher education in relation to what you call insidious inequalities. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about insidious inequalities in relation to deficit imaginaries.
Thanks, Nicola. And if can I have the next slide, please? So, so in my book, The Right to Higher Education, I'm really trying to tackle the more subtle forms of inequality that play out, because we spend a lot of time thinking about barriers. And barriers are also important, but the barriers sort of assume that there's this concrete thing, tangible thing we can identify, we can measure, and then we can transform. And of course, that is true to some extent. If we think about barriers like not having childcare, or not having safe housing, or not having transportation, or not having the financial funds to be able to, fully participate in higher education. So those are all very, very important. I would talk about those in relationship to redistribution, but redistribution always works with the more subtle forms of inequality, because we misrecognize that those maldistributions of access to appropriate resources, quality education, all the foundational things that enable capability to be recognized, become misrecognized in the person who's seen as suffering from some form of status subordination. So this is very much related to questions of identity formation, and the ways in which we think about difference. And I think difference is more hidden than the way we think. We talk about diversity a lot. We celebrate diversity a lot. Diversity is very important, but it tends to focus on, kind of counting the number of diverse bodies in spaces. Difference is much more tricky in a sense for us to recognize. And so difference is often about the way that personhood is constructed, always in relation. So it's constructed in relation to those who are seen as different. So we end up sort of perpetuating what I might call polarizing discourses. So the idea of the traditional versus the non-traditional student, and that kind of goes on. So whenever we make an iteration about a particular ideal sense of studenthood, then we're often implying the opposite. And we set up these binaries in relation to difference. And we also struggle to, to recognize and to work with rather than against our differences, because those are about contestations. And in pedagogical terms, those are really, really, really challenging, in the teaching space, in the teaching and learning space, for example. But coming back to the idea of misrecognition and insidious inequalities, I've talked a lot about how these institutionalized misrecognitions that are historical, and they're connected to multidimensional inequalities outside of higher education, but have an impact on higher education identity. And they're often experienced through internalized sensibilities of shame. And this is exacerbated by individualism. So we operate in a kind of society that focuses on the individual and individual success, and is very preoccupied by what I'll call cultures of prestige. And that's asserted through discourses of excellence. And it's, underpinned by league tables and rankings that universities are also implicated in these power relations and dynamics. They're not outside of them, of course. So, we often talk about the brightest and the best in higher education. And that's an example of the taken for granted ways that the discourse of excellence sustains institutionalized misrecognition, and is embedded in notions of excellence without consideration of the effects on long-standing inequalities. So coming back to shame, which is not a word that we use a lot in higher education, but I think it's really important because we think about this a lot in relation to a more psychological individual concept of imposter syndrome. But I think we need a broader sociological understanding of the social phenomenon in which social forms of inequality, such as misrecognition, become embodied in the sense of self, as a sense of unworthiness, as a sense of not belonging, and shame. So this is not about lack of confidence, lack of resilience, lack of self-efficacy, or any of those ideas around deficit. It is about the histories in which misrecognition has played out in social and institutional contexts, and then is erased from view with a primary focus on the individual to transform herself. So shame is then felt at the personal level, but it's a social emotion tied to the cumulative experiences of misrecognition. It is hidden through discursive maneuvers that locate the problem of equity in the body of the person or community, constructed through deficit imaginaries. A social justice analysis then helps us to understand the relationship between misrecognition, deficit imaginaries, and personal sensibilities of unworthiness, not belonging, alienation, and shame. And this moves away from individualized notions of imposter syndrome to understanding the relationship of sensibilities of not belonging. As a profound form of misrecognition, then, shame is internalized as a feeling of lack of self-worth or sense of failure. And the students I've interviewed for over 2 decades have articulated such feelings so powerfully. And I don't have time to bring in quotes, but I have so many examples of these expressions of shame. And that brings a deeper understanding of how and why students might feel that they do not belong in higher education. So, when we're thinking about a strategy around building belonging, we really need to think about this relationship between, the social forms of injustice around misrecognition and how that manifests in these forms of a sense of shame or being a failure or not being worthy or not being the right kind of person to participate in higher education. Furthermore, so misrecognition and shame underlie embodied and everyday experiences of inequality and exclusion. So these are not just one-off. This is the thing that we often think about, one-off incidents or things that we're going to overcome. But these are usually with people who have suffered forms of injustice. They have been experienced over and over again over time. So they manifest in an internalized sense of personhood. And discourses such as inclusion appear to be benevolent, but are reproductive of misrecognition because they place the weight of responsibility for overcoming social disadvantage on the individual who suffered social disadvantage. So it's terribly unfair. And arguably, the discourse of inclusion coerces those seen as excluded to conform to the conventions, the expectations, and values of dominant cultures and practices. So projects of equity become narrow to individual projects of self-transformation in order to fit into the dominant framework. And this might include becoming flexible, all the kinds of discourses that are familiar, becoming adaptable to volatile market conditions, being recognized as appropriately resilient. And this is regardless, this is kind of erases from view the unequal and differential resources available to different participants. So misrecognition is not only about the students, but is also relevant to the experiences of staff. I think that these, we might recognize some of these things in our own experiences. If I take the example of equity practitioners who tend to work on the periphery of universities, outside of academic faculties and departments, I think that there is a form of misrecognition in play about the expertise and knowledge and understanding of equity practitioners and what they can bring to an institutionalized project of transformative equity. So, I just ask, if equity work takes place at the margins of universities, what are the possibilities for deep-seated patterns of educational inequality and exclusion to really be shifted, disrupted, and challenged? No wonder we continuously see that the patterns of inequality just keep going on despite, major investment in equity. So can I just have the next slide? Can I please? Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. So if equity is located at the peripheries, it tends to be seen as someone else's responsibility, or it's hard, I think, for people across the different practices in higher education to get to grips with, even if they're very passionately committed to equity, how their work immediately relates to building equity. So there's no space for that because academic research and practitioner knowledge become separated rather than brought together in dialogue to co-produce and deepen our understanding. And as I said, equity practitioners' immense knowledge then is not fully supported, recognized, or disseminated. So there's a fragmentation and again, an individualization of what really needs to be a collective, institutional, and community-wide commitment to equity. Coming back just very briefly to the evidence stuff, this idea of evidence has been extensively critiqued in the critical theoretical literature as framed by objectifying paternalistic and/or colonizing sets of technologies. And these regulate, discipline, and limit our imaginations of who is seen as having the right to higher education. It emphasizes generalizability and objectivity, and as I said, on focusing on the measurable. And so we do need this evidence to show that equity matters. I'm not arguing that we don't need quantitative methods, but we need that within a broader praxis-based framework. And, we need that to capture the ways social and cultural inequalities are often unwittingly reproduced. People are not deliberately trying to be discriminatory, but this happens through our taken for granted assumptions because we aren't given the time and space to think about those. And this is often referred to as unconscious bias. And it's really important for individuals to exercise self-reflexivity in ways that raise awareness about how our unconscious bias feeds into deficit imaginaries and the judgment of others that can lead to exclusion. And those, as I've said already, with the institutional authority to judge and assess are often deeply entrenched in the taken for granted constructions of potential and capability. But individual awareness of unconscious bias on its own, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing this, we should, but on its own is not going to create transformational change because this always has to be combined with collective work to transform institutional structures, policies, practices, cultures, etc. We need access to the tools that are required to interrogate the workings of inequality in and through higher education. It's all very well to say that's what's needed, but then if we're not offered the tools to do that work, then it becomes very, very frustrating and difficult. So, I think that praxis is the tool that we need as a general framework, but within that, lots of different tools that could help open up time and space for critical reflection action. So we need to develop our practice in dialogue with social justice research and theory. And we also need practice-informed research to ensure that our academic research is grounded in the challenges faced by practitioners. That's why we need this kind of cycle of praxis, and we need to do that collaboratively. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to draw on, you mentioned constructs of potential earlier. One of your research projects, Art for a Few, you actually explored admissions and pedagogical strategies in relation to understanding constructs of potential. Could you tell us a bit more about this project and what you found? And then how did that lead to your idea of shifting, so you've just been talking about praxis, of shifting from communities of practice to communities of praxis? I think that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Nicola. And yeah, if you can go back to that next slide, Art for a Few. And this project was undertaken quite a while ago now. It was published in 2009, but I think it's had a pretty big impact. And it's a wonderful case to help to understand the kinds of points that I'm trying to bring attention to, I think, especially when we look at one particular case study, which is of Nina, who was one of the few young Black women applicants that we were able to observe her interview of. There were very, very few Black young women applying for art and design courses, and I think we undertook about 80 observations of real life selection interviews, and the whole process from the kind of assessment of the portfolio to the actual interview to the discussion after the interview. And so it was a very rich, and we also undertook interviews with admissions tutors to try to understand how they articulated their understanding of potential. And I don't have time to go into that. It's really interesting though, because they didn't have a very strong way to articulate potential, or it was something that was very, very value laden, And one of the things in the observations of the selection interviews that we understood was that the practice of asking standard questions was seen to be transparent and fair, but the questioning of the questions themselves did not take place. So there was a lack of understanding that the values seeped into the questions that were asked. So in the case study of Nina, can we go to the next slide, please? Who is applying for a BA fashion course. And she is asked at the beginning of the interview, like all other candidates, what influences her artwork. And after she responded hip hop, her interview was really quickly cut short. We felt like the selection panel sort of withdrew from her. Their body language kind of was pulled back, and they sped up the whole thing. And she also was denied the opportunity to complete her admissions test. And then we observed the post-interview process and a discussion about why they would reject her. And they suggested that the reason they had to reject her was because she had inappropriate influences. She was immature because she wanted to remain living at home. So she wanted to go to the local university. And that the way she was dressed showed that she lacked fashion flair, although we observed that the other young women seemed to be dressed very, very similarly to Nina. So that was quite odd. But more formally, they discussed how they would record this on the formal kind of form that they had to fill in. And so they said that her portfolio had been assessed as weak, even though we observed her assessment of her portfolio, and it had been ranked as good in the pre-interview assessment process. Immediately after Nina's interview, a male white middle-class candidate was interviewed. And when he was asked about his influences, he cited famous contemporary artists. He was dressed in really expensive designer clothing. And he said, in answer to the question about leaving home, he said he would definitely be leaving home, as it's all part of the university experience. And despite having significantly poorer qualifications than Nina, including having failed his secondary school art, he was offered a place while Nina was rejected. Can I have the next slide, please? So the case study illuminates how power works within a specific field of practice to undermine recognition of legitimate personhood, value, and status. It's important to identify the interconnection of misrecognition to maldistribution, as the embodied person is judged in the interview situation, not only in terms of what they say, but also in terms of clothing that is worn and the kinds of places. So one of the questions that was asked was, where do you travel? And also, where do you shop? Well, I suppose you can see where that's connected to fashion, but also that there are deeply embedded value judgments around where people have access to travel and the kinds of shops that they can go to. So this reveals the more subtle processes of inequality that are generated at the material, cultural, and emotional levels, and yet are not explicitly articulated, and they're not immediately observable in any straightforward, measurable, or quantifiable way. So it illustrates the need for methodologies that help bring insidious inequalities to the surface in order to build more nuanced and sophisticated equity frameworks. So with the example of this project, Art for a Few, it enabled an analysis that illuminated how the location of the admission tutors in entrenched communities of practice, with their shared sets of taken for granted assumptions and values about potential, led to the misrecognition of candidates such as Nina. So they were not deliberately exercising discrimination towards Nina. I think that's a really important point. They thought that they were acting in a fair and transparent way, but the effect of the taken for granted values that were embedded in the whole process meant that Nina was excluded from the program. And a focus on praxis helps to ensure that these points are not only abstract ones, but can also help transform practice. So with a commitment to this, we held workshops about the research with art and design educators across the whole country. This research was undertaken in the UK. And we encourage colleagues to engage with the research beyond our dissemination workshops to strengthen communities of practice by transforming these into what I call communities of praxis. Sorry, is it possible to go?
We seem to be having a problem with the next slide. There we go.
Yeah, that was that slide. So if we can go to the next slide after that, that would be great. Thank you. That's perfect. So an example of the transformative potential this praxis-based process enabled was the engagement of one program team who were responsible for one of the most selective fine arts programs in England. And engaging with the research, they looked closely at their admissions, their pedagogies, their assessment practices, and a whole new perspective emerged that deeply concerned them. And they realized, they really didn't look at this before, but they realized that they had no representation from the immediate local schools, colleges, and communities in their area, and that their student profile was hugely homogeneous, mainly white middle-class students from across more affluent areas far away in England. So the team started to work really closely with the equity unit at the university, the local schools and local colleges, and developed regular meetings. So this is about a sustained process over time to collectively reform the ways they thought about what counted as potential, talent, and capability. And they interrogated their values, perspectives, and assessment practices. And they developed inclusive capacity to start to accommodate a more diverse artistic set of expressions that better represented the university's underrepresented local communities. And they've sustained this commitment over time. Their student profile, in fact, I just got an email just a few months ago, their student profile remains dramatically shifted to a highly diverse student body with strong representation from local communities. And the curriculum has developed organically as new artistic expressions have emerged from their diverse student communities, which were then recognized, valued, and also represented. So this is what I call a community of praxis. I'm just aware of the time. I'll leave those points on the slide that help us to see what the kind of characteristics are around a community of praxis.
Thank you for highlighting, going through that project, Penny, because it's so powerful when you talk it through and see the change after the understanding, yes, is there. And yeah, the change is phenomenal in that community. So thank you for going through that. And that brings us back to ACU, actually. So as you know, we have been undertaking this deliberative process across the institution to try and identify areas within our practices and structures where maybe we can embed equity, and we're trying to do that being underpinned by deepening our own understandings of equity that you're talking about, and trying to work towards that culture of inclusivity. But obviously that's challenging. So I wonder if you can help us here, Penny. Can you talk to us about the challenges of deepening understanding and knowledge of equity, and maybe some ways that we can approach it, and maybe even referring to your framework of poems?
Thank you. Yeah. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I'll try to condense it because I want to make sure we have some time for discussion. But I suppose one of the most important, sorry, can we go to the next one after that? That was the slide with all the characteristics of a community of praxis, but I assume that will make this available to everybody after,
Yes.
So people can have a look. But, really importantly, I think, just broadening out the scope, the framework that we've developed in CEHI, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a moment, is really about taking a much broader notion of research in the field of equity and also of pedagogy. That pedagogy is about the collective spaces that enable us to make meaning and knowledge together. So, if we take a much broader sense of everything that we do is pedagogical, in fact, that all of our interactions are pedagogical. So, in terms of thinking about our relationship to our equity work, whether that's teaching or whether that's practice, equity practice, whatever that means, everything, of course, is equity practice, or whether it's research, let's think about ourselves as researchers. And I have this kind of slash there, because this hyphen there, because it's about the way that we search for meaning through our human capacity to reflect, and how that shapes our doing in the world. So, it's really important that, coming back to that point I made earlier, that everything, we're all theorists, and we bring our theories to everything that we do. But if we slow that down, if we're enabled by the institution to create the time and space and the different resources required, we can really engage in this notion of being researchers. So, and that helps us to imagine, to kind of reimagine the way that we construct the problem of equity. And I think that's really important. I'm going to kind of skip through, we can get to the discussion. But if coming back to this idea of Foucault's idea of regimes of truth, that, equity in its effect, a discourse, it's also material. It's about redistribution of resources, and it's about the things that we do. But the ways in which we imagine what it is discursive. It's about the power knowledge in which we make meaning around what equity is and who is, I guess, subjected to equity. So, the way that coming back to this idea that deficit imaginaries are embedded in the foundations of the way that we've approached equity, these can become really powerful regimes of truth that sometimes lead us to believe there is no alternative. And I would say that's a really dangerous position for us to take. So, I want us to consider how we imagine equity through particular regimes of truth, but also to invite our fabulous capacity to reimagine and to dream other ways of being and doing. And I'm really drawing on Freire as well, very strongly here. This idea that, he talks about to dream is to make, but we have to do that together. We have to do that collectively. And of course, there's no one truth, but many contested truths. And that's what makes equity so complex. There will be lots of diverse and different positionings and perspectives of what is required. And that's really important. It really stops us from, focusing on kind of quick fix answers or a tick box kind of logic or the reassertion of our assumptions, rather than the interrogation of what we take for granted and working together to understand that. Unfortunately, this only keeps us, this kind of tick boxy kind of approach keeps us at the surface of the deeply entrenched issues that I've kind of set out, and perpetuates institutional complicity in the reproduction of inequalities, even when we're claiming to be committed to equity. And so I think that we need to go beyond counting, this kind of counting approach to equity, to a much deeper sense of accountability that's embedded in a rich ethical framework that brings attention, especially for those of us in relative positions of power, to our personal and collective responsibility for developing equitable frameworks in and through higher education. I always say in and through, because higher education, it's not just about being in, like a student and staff member in our daily encounters with higher education. Higher education is related to all other social contexts, and so are we as human beings. So it's in and through is really important. So I've already talked about the time and space, the importance of collaboration. We do, of course, around this. I'm sure everybody's thinking about the multiple constraints we all face on a daily basis. The pressurized funding and resources. We operate in what we might call a performative culture, which is driven by particular notions of individual productivity, which that keeps us going at a particular pace, and that seems to have sped up in lots of ways. And the ways that higher education tends to be outcome driven rather than process oriented, and short-term focused rather than supportive of this enduring commitment to equity, because this is a long-term process. These kinds of issues are not going to be like, oh, next year we're going to have transformed everything. It means kind of an enduring commitment to these questions and these problems. So can I just go to the next slide, please? And I'll start talking a little bit about this idea of poems. So poems is a framework that over the years, over the like 25 years that I've been working around trying to bring social justice insights together with practice, and doing that together now with my wonderful colleagues in the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education, but also many others, Nicola, you included, and many other people that are part of this important project together collaboratively. We've woven together these insights in a rather eclectic framework, and POEM stands for Praxis-Based Pedagogical Ethically Oriented Methodologies. So, you know, coming back to this idea, it's not about counting numbers of students or staff who are associated with equity categorizations. It's about building ethical orientations to equity that engage, you know, important questions, and the questions themselves are important to think through about our relationship to unequal power relations and how this might unwittingly produce insidious inequalities, such as in the case of Nina. But it also is a framework that enables a space for collective reflection and action, and for challenging those dominant frameworks of inclusion and equity that I've talked about, underpinned by deficit imaginaries. It's a way of generating time and space to deepen our collective engagement with equity. And with that, you know, time and space is important, but I still think you need those critical tools to enable praxis to happen. So those are really important. So it requires a shift in temporal orientation, one that reveals the insidious ways that certain values seep into our pedagogical and methodological imaginations, leading us to believe there is no alternative, and thus reproducing unwittingly unequal patterns of cultural value through evidence-based methods assumed to be neutral and value-free. So it helps extend our collective work. It really insists on challenging competitive postures, and which are, you know, I think, again, that's structural, and it's part of the discourse of excellence, but really trying to find ways that we can collaborate together. And working with communities of participants outside of higher education as well as inside of higher education, really thinking deeply about that dimension of representation as a form of social justice to co-develop equity programs designed to challenge inequalities. But all of this is really, it's really challenging. I'm not saying this is any way a kind of quick solution. It's more of an orientation. It's a reorientation in the way we think about our work. And if we think about communities of praxis as one of the means in which we can develop these kind of spaces and these timescapes of poems, that can open up, hopefully, the space for us to engage with some of these ideas. So I'll stop there, but I'll just go to the final slide. And that's just to say that there's a range of other resources to continue with engaging with these discussions beyond this keynote. And we've got a new graduate certificate in professional equity and inclusion, which will be available from January 2023. I talked about the Equity HE site. We've got the journal, and, you know, we'd be very interested in people wanting to write into the journal. We have a writing program which supports and mentors and encourages people to write into that space. And we have lots of open access reports and occasional papers. I've just put one up there, which is an older one, but it talks about, you know, these ideas around capability and misrecognition. So thank you so much for your time. And I think we only have about 10 minutes for a very brief discussion.
Thank you so very much, Penny. And you've got me thinking. I think that we will endeavour to try and shift our sort of emerging community of practice to a community of praxis over time. That's something I think we can aim to try and do. Thank you so much. We'll open up now, as Penny said, for wider discussion. So if we go over to any questions, I've got one. There's one question here that is asking if you can expand on the discourse of excellence a bit more.
Yeah, so the discourse of excellence is another one that probably needs a lot of deconstruction. But I think that it's another discourse that we tend to take for granted, and we don't think about the relationship of excellence to equity, and that they're often kind of in contestation with each other, because excellence tends to imagine that we can recruit particular people who represent the excellence we're aspiring towards. And we have these ideal notions of potential and talent and capability in those selection processes. But also it's so complicated. I mean, if we think about research and we think about, academic publishing practices, and the idea that, we're encouraged to publish in very particular journals with high impact factors that have very particular conventions around them, and that we're expected to be productive in particular ways around publishing a certain number of publications per year. I would question, what is the rigor in relationship to questions of social justice around that, in relation to the questions that I've sort of raised about, how knowledge is produced within the constraints of particular conventions that are upheld as excellent, but might not be asking questions about who is represented and in what ways, and what are the processes in which we're producing this knowledge? How does it affect, broader communities of people who are perhaps deeply implicated in the recommendations and the findings, but haven't had opportunity to really be part of the interpretation and analysis. So, I guess poems is trying to go some way to grapple with that. But also, I suppose I would just ask the question, is something excellent if it's inequitable? And, can we be challenged to think about, to reframe excellence in relation to equity, rather than think about it as separate from equity? But that means tackling some of these really challenging structures and also practices, because as I said, universities are also, like individuals, they're situated in these broader global politics of higher education. So if you can't just magic that away, they exist. But I suppose things like, maybe arguably, things like the Sustainable Development Goals help work towards challenging some of those discourses of excellence.
Yeah, and you were linking that to, I think you just mentioned it then, to sort of this notion of individualism as well that we've got currently in society. Can you expand on that a bit more and how that impacts?
Sorry, Nicola, I got distracted looking at the questions in the chat box. Say that again.
That's okay. Let's go with this question here. So we've got the idea of moving away from raising aspiration activities and more into developing that with communities is very interesting. Can you expand more on this idea of building trust and any examples of where you've seen that done?
Well, I think what I mean by that, so first of all, there's nothing wrong with understanding that aspirations are an important part of our identity, and so I'm not suggesting that we completely avoid or neglect attention to aspirations, but my understanding of aspirations is that aspirations are always formed in context, and people are very they're very wise in the way in which they form their aspirations, because they do that in relation to their experiences, both personally but also generationally. So if they've had experiences in which they've been excluded from education in various ways over the history of their families and their communities, then it's very likely that they're going to mistrust this idea that you can go in and just raise our aspirations and think, oh, university is a place that I belong. Furthermore, if they're not part of the project in which we are struggling as an institution to create that sense of belonging by recognizing the experiences, knowledges, values, and perspectives of those communities, it's unlikely that they will form a sense of trust. But also, again, this requires time. It requires a different orientation, because trust doesn't happen with one interaction. We know that relationships of trust happen over time. So I'll give an example of some of the programs within CHES, the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education, in which we are over time trying to develop those relationships of trust by working with community agencies, NGOs, with students themselves and young people and mature learners, or building a sense of belonging in members of the community, so that they can see a relationship to higher education. And that is, ongoing, and it's a commitment, and it's a different way of redistributing our resources so that they have access to some of the university opportunities, but not as a quick fix, as a relationship, as building a relationship with those communities and with those organizations. And similarly doing that with students. So rather than having a kind of more transactional approach to student support is developed in the context of students' lives, with a deep relationship with those students. So, for example, if students do have experiences of deep trauma, that they don't have to keep disclosing those experiences of trauma. There is a navigator who is working with those students on their behalf to protect the integrity of their identity and their experiences, but also navigate the systems and structures in the university with them. So those are two examples of some of the kinds of social justice principles being put to work and working in a different way to build those kind of relationships of trust.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to hear you use the word shame, because you're right, we don't use that word very much in higher education at all. Can you just maybe expand a little bit more on why you really feel it's important to use that word and to understand it?
Because I think that so many students that I've interviewed, and I have to say my own experiences as a survivor of gender-based violence, I think that those traumatic experiences and those experiences of feeling like you are the wrong kind of person, that those deficit imaginaries have seeped into your sense of not really belonging or not being proper. And that goes on. I still experience that. It's not something that just goes away. It's so deeply embedded because it isn't really about the individual. It's about the ongoing discourses of deficit that continuously coerce people to prove that they're worthy enough to be a participant. And so that manifests in this kind of shame. First of all, shame that, and imposter syndrome might be very useful in being able to articulate that sensibility. But I think, so that's something I think people can increasingly admit to. But I think that ongoing sense that I'm just not the right person. I'm not going to put myself forward because they'd never believe that I could be a person who could represent on a committee, be a student representative on a committee, for example. So yeah, I think these are they're really important because so we come back to this deficit approach that, what that person needs is, just to work on their confidence level, but it's not paying attention to the structures and the discourses at play that create that feeling in the first place.
Thank you so much, Penny. I could keep talking to you for much longer, but we've got a minute left, so I better wrap up. I honestly thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. I always love talking with you, Penny, and I always come away after talking with you having learned something, and you prompt my thinking. And I'm sure that for everyone listening and everyone listening today and watching you will have prompted a lot of thoughts, and there'll be a lot of conversation starters after this. So just thank you so much, Penny, for your time today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. And, I just wish you all the very best for the rest of the symposium. And I'm very honored to have been able to be part of the conversation. So thank you.